Good morning. So the topic of discussion today is growing India's entrepreneurial ecosystem. My name is Sandeep, and I'm the managing partner for Oakstone Partners, which is a boutique investment fund and advisory business focused on the social impact sector globally. And I'd like to introduce Raghav, Prajol, Prabhakar, and Rohit, who will all individually introduce themselves and the businesses that they're here to represent.
Hi guys, my name is Raghav Himmat Singha. I'm the founder and CEO of a company called Ricola. We are a technology-enabled trucking company. So we provide cargo transportation for manufacturing companies in India by road. And the easiest way to understand is that we are sort of like Uber for cargo transportation. We are a 3-year-old company headquartered out of Bombay and operating pan-India.
Hi everyone, I'm Prajol. I'm the founder of a company called Zochap. We're a big data platform headquartered in Berlin, in Germany. But we have our largest team here in Bangalore. It's the tech shop, so product, data science, and engineering. In this context, I'm also on the board of a company called NUA, a business I helped co-found 18 months ago. And that's a direct-to-consumer feminine care startup here based out of Mumbai and Bangalore.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Prabhakar. I represent DigitalOcean. We are a cloud computing platform headquartered in New York. We have a business in India. In fact, India is the second largest business for us globally. And outside of DigitalOcean, I've also been an entrepreneur in my past stint. So I'm happy to be here and share some experiences across both the business as well as the startup that I've been a part of.
Hi, I'm Rohit Kumar. We have a product called Chapter Vitamins, which is a mobile learning platform, which is being used by several businesses in the country to train their employees, especially the employees who are not anywhere near the head offices. And we are talking in scale in terms of hundreds and thousands of people who are outside the main cities in the country. And that's what we've been doing for the last 4 years since I started this company.
So we're very fortunate that the speakers here have quite diverse global experience of where they've operated and where they've lived and worked. So the conversation today is obviously about the ecosystem in India. And I'll ask Rohit this question. Where are the influences in the Indian ecosystem?
I think that the gap, that is probably a gap today. So you can have VCs, you can have the entrepreneurs, you can have customers. But to really create demand in a given sector, you need influencers who will write about it, who will publish research reports about it. And I see that while Gartner does that and other analysts do that abroad, and probably the banks also do it, I don't see it visible here in any of the sectors till it really becomes much bigger. The fact that Flipkart is still called a startup, people are focusing on that $16 billion valuations or 20 billion valuations, but not focused on where the real need is.
So your concern is that perhaps there is not enough institutional sector analysis encouraging investors, whether they be professional or not, to guide them and encourage them to actually come into sectors which are promoting lots of startup activity.
Absolutely. See, if you think about it, in a few more years, India will be the 3rd largest economy in the world. To not have any research reports published on sectors that will make it the 3rd largest economy today is such a huge gap. And that is going to influence how much capital comes in. Capital needs to be available at the right time. And in India, it's going to be actually about smaller ticket sizes, smaller amounts of capital, but a collection of businesses that would then make the economy what it'll be.
Understood. So talking about sectors, Prajol, you've noticed when you started your business in India that actually your growth is not being fueled from the sort of geographies, the metropoles that you thought it would be.
Yeah, so to Rohit's point, and then tagging onto yours, Sandeep, when we set up NUA 18 months ago, we were looking at direct-to-consumer businesses, and almost all the literature we found was US-centric. Right? And there were, of course, runaway success stories like Dollar Shave Club and Warby Parker and Casper and what have you. But if you look at India 10 years, 15 years from now and where the growth is going to come from, you do need intelligence on the local market. And you know, when we went into the business, we assumed that the growth sectors would primarily be the metropolitan cities, so the big six. What we realized is, of course, the big six drives growth, but a lot of the adoption, a lot of the venturesome consumption, if you will, where consumers are willing to try out new products, comes from the tier 1 and tier 2 cities.
So you're now adapting in order not to engage only with the metropoles, but actually focusing more on, you know, the non-city populaces.
Yeah, it has an impact across the business, right? It's all the way from when and how you address your potential customers through to how you deal with delivery and logistics. And of course, logistics in tier 2, tier 3 cities is very different from the metropolitan cities, as some of us will tell you. So you need to be able to adapt your business to serving your client base.
So that adaptation, I suppose, you know, what makes you competitive? I'll come to you, Prabhakar, because you had some thoughts on, you know, what makes an Indian entrepreneur, you know, successful, and what sort of drives him. You know, what gives him that competitive edge almost.
Sure. I think conventional wisdom tells that, you know, when an entrepreneur sets out to, you know, do his or her startup, you essentially kind of set out to solve for a need or a want, right? Essentially find a virgin territory that nobody else is occupying or serving, and kind of create a solution or a service that kind of caters to that market. I'll just take the example of our own company, DigitalOcean. When we started out in 2012, the cloud computing space that we operate in, we had a lot of big cloud providers already occupying the market leader space. And a lot of people, when we started the business, investors, well-wishers, actually said, you know, will you really think you'll be able to make a dent and make a difference to solving it differently? And we honestly thought that the experience that was being provided by a lot of the existing players had so much more to be improved. So, you know, conventional wisdom, while it says, you know, go ahead and find a virgin territory, I think there is a lot of opportunity to look at making things simpler, better, faster, however you want to put it, within those existing realms. And so entrepreneurs should constantly think about, you know, where can we make a difference? You know, it could be based on their own pain points that they've seen. And in our case, we did. We were developers at heart, and we thought that a lot of the solutions didn't really kind of solve the simplicity need that, you know, most developers would want. It was very, very complex. So we set out and created a solution, and today, you know, on a monthly basis, we have 3.5 million developers globally who come to our platform to, you know, understand technology, read, and use our platform. And that's a fair amount of growth that we've seen in a short span of time that just kind of validates, you know, the fact that there is a lot of impact that an entrepreneur could create, you know, be it India, be it globally, wherever else, despite existing solutions. If you think you can, you know, do something better, go for it, and then I think the results will kind of play out.
Okay. So, and that leads to Raghav. Raghav, you had mentioned that you feel that there is a changing a shift in attitude towards risk and entrepreneurialism, and which is not, you know, which is also a key driver to this sector growing.
Yeah, so when I look at how we can expand the entrepreneurial ecosystem in India, we have to realize that being an entrepreneur in India was not really something to aspire to about 7-8 years ago. You go to an engineering college, you get a job, and that was your career path. I think in the last 10 years, we have come a long way where being an entrepreneur has actually become aspirational. In fact, to the point that it has now become fashionable somewhat to raise money. And what I feel is that what India now needs is to break away from that aspiration of just raising money to actually understanding how to evolve your business. Because we are seeing a lot of companies that get funded at the angel stage, but then fail to raise funds later. And that's probably just because of how nascent the Indian market is compared to maybe the US or the China market. So there is a real need where startups and founders need to understand what their business model is, who their real customers are, how they're going to grow, and whether they actually need equity capital or risk capital, as we call it, at all. So if we talk about our business, for example, we did raise a small round of investment as we started, but we very quickly realized the fundamentals of our business model, and we realized that we don't really need risk capital to grow, and we raised debt capital. And today we are, if you see the industry and if you see our competitors in terms of unit metrics, in terms of profitability, all of those numbers, we've done really well just because we focused on the business model and not chased risk capital as such. So I think a lot of founders and startups could gain from that kind of education and that kind of push and maturity from the venture community, from investors, and also, as Rohit was mentioning, all the influencers.
So a couple of points there. Obviously, society is now embracing risk, embracing entrepreneurialism, encouraging its youth to, to go out and not take a job, but to, to apply themselves in some sort of venture. But one of the restrictions, obviously, you've mentioned, and is it's a common constraint, is capital raising. So, Rohit, you had some concerns about this, and so you're obviously on the cusp of raising money for your business soon. What are the problems that you're facing?
Well, I would say, when you think about capital and raising capital as well as sort of where it's going to be deployed, the question is, who are you going to raise it from? Who's going to have a similar market outlook in terms of how do you attack the problem, and who really believes in the problem that you're trying to solve? So, for instance, what we see in India is that typically somebody may say, grow this business to be 100 times from where it is today in revenue terms. The reality in India is that the 100 times revenue may come from 1,000 times more customer acquisition or user acquisition, right? And how are you going to get that? And where are those users coming from? So it's really making sure that whoever is coming in believes in this part of the story. But coming on to capital, is it capital that will lead to follow-on rounds as well, will support you as you build the business? Because you can't be looking every 12 to 18 months for more investors to come in. You'd rather work with the investors as partners who will support you over the next 2-3 years till you really start seeing the explosion in the business.
And that's vital for the success, the ongoing success of any business, especially a startup. It's very rare that a business will only need one round of funding. So taking on strategic partners which are there for the long haul, who buy into the vision and will then follow on, is quite important. It's actually vital. But do you find that those types of smaller institutional investors are there? Because my understanding of the Indian market is that investor, post family and friends, pre sort of Series A, there are not that many investors, or the environment is actually not particularly sophisticated here. There's not that many players in that.
It's absolutely right, because if you think about, I'll give you two analogies. One is if you go back 15 years ago into the Indian stock markets, most companies in global terms would have been classified as mid-market or SMEs in terms of market cap valuations. The companies were IPOing at a 10 million valuation, right? 50 million was a great valuation. The same companies have become several $billion in the last 15 years. Similarly, in the VC space, or for startups to raise the kind of money, maybe you don't need $10 million to raise a round in India to achieve what we need to achieve. Maybe Ricola needs that kind of money, but maybe we don't, right? So there are not many whose incentives are aligned by taking a longer term bet on a smaller amount of money with the ability to maybe double up as time goes on, because for whatever reason, all the big VCs now have started seeing the bigger exits coming from Flipkart, so they all want deals like that. They're not looking at the deals that are really needed in the country today, that need funding.
Sure. And you had some thoughts.
Yeah. So even from my personal experience, raising money for a later stage company based out of Berlin, Germany, versus a very early stage in India. So when we raised money for Zochap, even the Series A, Series B stages 2-3 years ago, there was a large pool of investors to draw from, both in Europe, across the pond in the US, even Asian investors. Most recently, NUA has been looking to raise, and it's now in the final stages of a Series A round, a sizable Series A round. But the actual pool of investors was quite small. So if you look at the total quantum of capital in the Indian market, or the venture capital in the Indian market, that's growing year on year. But the numbers are skewed, very skewed by a handful of mega rounds, which is important for those late stage companies. But there's also too many Series B, Series C rounds in the mix, which skews the average. If you look at the median value, it's actually quite small. And there's a crunch when it comes to angel and Series A stage companies. So this is a top quality team. It's a fantastic business. And it took them 7 to 8 months to raise a Series A round, which would be very unusual for a comparable company in Europe or the US.
So obviously, wherever you are in the world, capital raising is fundamental to your existence, but it can't just be capital raising that's restricting sort of the growth of these startups. Talent acquisition is obviously another concern. Prabhakar, what do you think about that?
Right, sure. I think, one of the things that's changed in the Indian ecosystem is there's a lot more appetite for participating and then being a part of startups. On the flip side, though, I think what startups compete with is a lot more established companies that's throwing a lot of money at them. So if you want to kind of go ahead and get quality talent, as a startup, that's always a challenge, right? And one of the other things that this panel we were kind of discussing up front is I don't think there's good understanding of a lot of the other things than just base salary or pure compensation, right? Things like ESOPs. While it's early, in the Indian market where there have been fair amount of secondary market sales or exits to actually realize the actual benefit of ESOPs, it's still a big challenge for early stage employees to kind of understand the benefits that ESOPs would pay out in the long term. And again, I think that's a function of the entire startup ecosystem in the Indian market being fairly early. Over time, I think that's something that will be kind of solved for. The other thing that's potentially also working, and at least been working for DigitalOcean, is if you want quality talent, don't necessarily have them kind of relocate to wherever you are. As a company, we've been trying with remote work culture, right? And it's a fairly new concept for India. It doesn't happen very often, but we've seen a lot of that successfully work for us in the US and increasingly now in India as well. People still want the comfort of wherever they are without having to put up with traffic and high cost of living in wherever some of the metropolitans, but still are able to contribute very effectively to whatever they're doing. So I think as startups, one of the things that we should potentially also look at is embracing remote work culture and if you find the right talent, go get them wherever they are, and then don't have to worry about all of the other things.
Sure, so I can certainly reinforce your first point. Because of the lack of liquidity in the market, especially prior to the spate of recent exits, there was no understanding of the value of equity, right? So you could offer a developer even 1% in the company, but that didn't actually translate to anything tangible for them because they just couldn't understand its value. And we faced this problem 3 years ago. We were looking to attract top quality engineering talent from the likes of an Adobe or an eBay or a Google, and it was very hard to compete with those offers because we just couldn't negotiate on the right terms. Today, of course, that's different because there has been some liquidity, there have been some exits. Engineers understand the value of equity, especially early stage equity. But even then, I'd say we're in the nascent stages of that realization.
So what I feel is that because startups in India are usually started by founders who are much younger, they have very limited experience in working in companies. And because of that, their first instinct is to hire a person who has more experience, who already knows the job, and that's why it becomes more expensive to get the talent that we want. What we've done at our company is tried to hire people at more or less the fresher level, or people who are very young, not so much experienced, but have trained them on the job. And I think if a lot more companies try to develop talent rather than hire for talent, it might be better for the entire ecosystem, because everybody's just trying to hire from established companies, and of course, that's going to be hard to compete with on the price.
Understood.
Could I add something to that as well? It's an interesting anecdote. Several years ago, we had arranged an event where we had the founder of Yatra.com and founder of the company Prop Tiger, and they both said the biggest challenge in building a business in India is the talent. And I was that time working for a multinational, and I looked at them and said, quite honestly, being back in India for 10 plus years, the biggest joy has been actually finding such great talent. So where are you guys hiring from? Now, fast forward a few years later, 4 years of being an entrepreneur, that is the single biggest challenge in the country. Simply because you don't attract the best talent. The best talent is risk averse. Their parents want them to get the best job with a big brand name. They follow that path. There may be 10,000 people like that in the country, but there are not 1 million people like that in the country. And so startups can't find the right people.
Understood. So last night, we were having a discussion about what the Indian government is doing to support the entrepreneurial ecosystem. Perhaps you'd like to share some of the thoughts that you had about some of the policies that they were trying to implement and whether they had been effective or not.
Well, if you really think about from an entrepreneur's perspective, and for any businessman, and India has actually got many more entrepreneurs than people who work in companies. Reducing regulatory compliance is the number one thing. And when you add things like GST, which now you have to file every month. When service tax was there, I had one location in the country, one aspect on service tax. Now with GST, if I have 3 offices, I have to have a GSTIN number for each. I have to have monthly compliance on each. My accountant has to file 3 returns. This didn't exist with service tax. Now, in addition, what the government has done is not thought about the working capital, that the reason it doesn't feel like 7+% economic growth is all of it is going into working capital. Because 30% of any revenue you get as a services business, 10% tax deduction at source, 18% whatever, that's 28%, is just going into working capital for the government. All of it is going to the government. So even if you're growing at 8%, 30%, earlier you were paying less when service tax was lower, etc. So I think what has happened is that the capital has been sucked out of the system into the government, and all entrepreneurs, big, small, businesses, whether it's L&T, whether it's exporters, they're all struggling with the working capital issue. And that's the single biggest issue impacting the country today that the government could do something to ease. Whether they will or not, one won't know, even with the budget, whatever may be announced in the budget. This is the single biggest issue in the country.
So having some experience with a number of governments who are encouraging grassroots entrepreneurialism, what is the Indian government doing outside of tax, outside of tax incentives? But are they helping, funding, promoting the sector? Are they doing anything sort of at grassroots level to encourage that entrepreneurialism?
I think there was well-intentioned moves that were announced with Startup India a few years ago. I don't think it has really reached any level of scale in the country in terms of whether it's 100 companies being funded versus the millions of micro entrepreneurs in the country that could have been benefited by other schemes. The Sovereign Wealth Fund hasn't really announced any investments yet. So I don't know if they've made any or not.
Sure. And talking about micro entrepreneurs, you had some thoughts about how we should be more encouraging and enabling of sort of micro entrepreneurs in rural India as well.
One of the biggest things we are seeing with our business is a number of our clients are in the BFSI space, and whether it's insurance. So we have 3 of the 7 large health insurance companies in the country as clients, whether it's microfinance, whether it's auto finance. A lot of it is the demand is coming from rural India. A lot of the users getting trained on it are from rural India. And they, in turn, play a role in facilitating ease of capital to people who need it over there. So if you really think about why is health insurance selling more in Jharkhand than in maybe the outskirts of Delhi, it's very simple, because more people from Jharkhand are working in Delhi. The family is understood, if I ever fall sick, I have to go to Delhi. So I need to have insurance. And when you start looking at how this can create a need for people to educate, create micro-entrepreneurs who will help with insurance, agents who will then start creating financial awareness, provide loans, provide little amount of micro loans to buy insurance even, or financing options, etc. All of this will lead to so many more micro-entrepreneurs coming up in the country. And it is a linkage between urban India and rural India. And I think that's where a lot of focus should go on, because that's happening. The majority of people born in India, the demographic dividend is sitting in smaller town India. They have to get educated, they need jobs, they'll come to the city, but they'll feed 10 people back in the local economy. And that, who is taking care of making sure that that business thrives?
The only thing I'd add to that is the talent lens, right? And the current government and previous governments have all done well to increase the pool of funding available to especially the top tier of educational institutions, because the reality is that in India, the top talent does come from the publicly funded institutions, so that needs to grow. I think it's also true of India and elsewhere that jobless growth is an issue, right? So if you look at Prabhakar's company, it's a very large company, 400 people globally, right? If you look at my company, Zochap, we are 85 globally, right? So there's only so much talent we can absorb as a company. So a lot of the talent in the country needs to be entrepreneurial in their own right, not only to join early stage institutions, but actually found those businesses and embrace that opportunity. And that's something that's still a work in progress. Some of the institutions do have frameworks in place, incubators in place, but we need many more of those.
Right. If I may add, I think one of the developments that we've been seeing in the ecosystem is a lot more participation from the private entities, right? So we have a lot more accelerators, incubators, a lot of venture capital firms that are not Indian origin, but are now kind of setting up shop in India. Despite what the government may or may not do, I think the activity that we're seeing in the private investment space, a lot of corporates today have their own accelerators, and they're kind of working very closely with startups that play in the same space, and obviously kind of either get them on or acquire them eventually. So I think those are good developments that we're seeing in the ecosystem. Just going back to the Silicon Valley, a lot of accelerators, including Y Combinator's, Techstars of the world, now look at India as a very active breeding ground for startups. So if you look at the cohort of Indian startups making it to those batches, it's increasing every cohort. And that's kind of a signal of not just the activity in India, but also the fact that they're kind of creating solutions not just relevant for the Indian demographic, but potentially applicable for a lot of markets outside India.
Thank you so much, Raghav, Prajol, Prabhakar, and Rohit for this firebrand session.